Good afternoon or good morning, depending upon where you are, or good evening, depending upon where you are in the world. Thanks for joining this morning, Natasha and I. Um, I'm going to start us off, and then I'll hand it over to Natasha. But before I start, I've been working a little bit on doing inclusive introductions, and so I'm going to do an inclusive introduction. My name's Raj. My pronouns are he, him. If you are in a place where you have difficulty seeing or you have difficulty seeing, I have brown skin, a black shirt, gray hair. I always want to say that it's gray and black, but honestly, it's really more gray at this point. And I'm sitting in a blue room with lots of art on the wall. And I want to acknowledge that I live and work in Boulder, Colorado, which is land that was taken from the Ute, Arapaho, and Cheyenne people, the people who shared, cared for, and borrowed from this land in a relationship that is far richer than our current concept of land ownership. 48 contemporary tribes are tied to this state called Colorado. Also want to acknowledge my country's history of enslaving people and the ongoing harms that extend even today from that practice. And finally, as a member of global community, I want to acknowledge the legacy and damage and ongoing damage from colonialism. I share these acknowledgments mostly to remind myself, honestly, as a person and as a scientist, to really think about harms and effort to repair harms in the work I do as a scientist and a person. And that's actually a nice introduction to this notion of community science, because in some ways, community science is about thinking about science as an ally, both in repairing harms and building better and more creative and more just futures. That's sort of my nutshell definition of community science. I realize people walk in with all kinds of experiences themselves. And so just to kind of level set a little bit, we wanted to start with a poll and ask you kind of um, what your familiarity with community science is. And so if you wouldn't mind just answering these questions, picking an answer. Also, just want to acknowledge we are lucky to have kind of a smallish group today. So I think we can keep this pretty interactive. Natasha, I'm sure you're cool with that, right? So if people want to jump off and share, if you want to use the chat to share thoughts as we go, if you want to unmute and do stuff, that's all cool. So even as you think about this poll question is, are people seeing a poll pop up on their screens? Great. Okay, if you could take a minute to answer it, and then if you want to type in some comments or share some comments about your experience with community science, welcome to do that. Cool. Well, this is a nice spread. This is a nice spread. We've got some people who are experienced. We have some people first time hearing the term. So um, just come on in as we talk about this. I'll start by introducing the way I think about community science, the way AGU tends to define community science. Um, Lisa, your comment is spot on. Like, this is a lot like community-based participatory research. It's got a whole set of histories in lots of different disciplines, and it even has histories outside the scientific community, particularly with environmental justice groups who have said science can be a tool for affecting change, and have approached it from that lens. Um, but for me, or when I think about community science, I think about it sort of in terms of this picture kind of motivates my conception of community science. This is a picture of Darby, which is one of the largest impermanent settlements in the world. This neighborhood is actually near my grandfather's house. And what you're seeing here, what this little girl is walking on is a water pipe that's taking fresh water through this neighborhood, not into this neighborhood, through this neighborhood, and into one of the wealthiest suburbs of Mumbai. And it's right next to a creek. It's right next to what used to be a natural system. And for me, the juxtaposition of a technical solution that isn't equitable with a natural ecosystem that's been so degraded, that was equitable and has been so degraded as to be basically unusable, calls into question the sort of the purpose and role that science can play. How did science become complicit in creating situations like this? How was research misused in this way to advantage some people and expense other people and destroy an ecosystem? And how can we rethink about the roles in which science and technology participate in society so that pictures like this aren't happening here or anywhere else in the world? I think for me, what this calls to mind is the fact that science, that our current challenges, the challenge of the Anthropocene, the challenges of figuring out what it means to repair those harms and to build just futures, require we think about science in a new way, in an additional way. It doesn't mean throwing out the wonderful things we've accomplished with science. It means building on those things and doing it in a way that's fundamentally more participatory. And that's what I think about when I think about community science. It's this notion of engaging in a partnership that contributes science to building a better world, that recognizes that science is a valuable tool, but it's one of many valuable tools and it needs to be part of a process. And that scientists alone can't solve problems any more than any other group of experts can. And that expertise doesn't reside uniquely in the scientific community, but there are many kinds of expertise, many kinds of ways of knowing and being in the world. So when we think about community science at AGU, we tend to articulate four big principles. The first principle is that community science always begins with community priorities. It's never about a scientist coming in and telling a community what they should do. It's about listening to the community's aspirations for themselves, listening to the community's goals, and finding a way science can support those goals. That word priorities is really important. I had a mayor once tell me, I am tired of rich cities having priorities and poor cities having needs. And for me, it recalls this idea of asset-based framing, for those of you who might be from an education background, right? The second thing about community science is it ends with community impact. Um, we have an informal mantra in Thriving Earth Exchange. A paper is not an outcome. Even if it includes the community leaders that you worked with as co-authors, it's still not an outcome. A paper is a wonderful thing, but it is not a community outcome. It is not something changing in the world to make the world more just and more fair. It can be a piece of that. It can contribute to that. So we try to design projects where the community outcome is as much a priority as the scientific outcome or the understanding-based outcome. The third principle is that science is a human right, that every community, every person deserves the right to ask and answer their scientific questions. And it shouldn't just be communities who have access to universities, who have access to partners, who have access to money. We work sometimes with communities who are on the fence line. They might be on one side of a large factory and they can't find the resources to measure air quality in their neighborhood, but the factory on the other side of the fence has the instruments and has the scientists who can measure air quality. And we think everybody should be able to measure that air quality and have honest conversations about what they're seeing through their measurements. Um, and finally, what we've learned from working with a lot of different community-based organizations, a lot of people who are deeply steeped in issues of justice and sustainability, is that the way you work is inseparable from the work you do. We sometimes tend to think that outcomes can be separated from process. And what I think I've learned more and more in working in community science is that process and outcomes are almost impossible to distinguish from each other. It's sort of this notion of community-based participatory research, that the process of doing the work is part of the work in and of itself. So when we put it all together, we kind of think about it as the process by which scientists and communities use, pursue, apply, actually set scientific priorities together, using science to advance one or more community priorities. It centers communities who have historically been shut out of science or even exploited by or marginalized by science. And it centers and follows the leadership of local context, knowledge, and expertise. Or to put it really simply and really bluntly, communities drive the bus. Science has a seat on the bus, but science doesn't get to drive the bus. Driving the bus is a collaborative process. I'm curious, we saw in the poll some folks were familiar with citizen science, community science. I'm curious if I could just pause here and sort of hear what you're thinking when you hear this kind of definition and how that jives with the way you might have thought about community science or the way you might be thinking about citizen science. Yeah. Dan, you've got your hand up. Thank you for being the brave first person to talk.
Um, I was gonna say it kind of makes me think of like I wonder about the kind of the practical like systemic ways that this can be done, and just like getting a lot of people's input and sort of synthesizing it into one clear objective, and then having um, like colleges and universities, for example, be a resource that the community can then come to collectively and draw on to solve certain issues. So I'm just curious about the sort of structures that can be put in place to like help facilitate this kind of idea.
Oh, that is a brilliant question. So I'm hearing two questions there. One question is sort of about, as somebody doing the work, how do you sort of how do you navigate a process that can be messy in terms of really identifying a priority and then tackling that priority in a way that's engaging and represents sort of a broad perspective? And then the second question I think I was hearing was around, what about the institutional structures that make that more or less easy to do in your role as a part of a university? Did I get those two questions right?
Yeah, I'd say that's correct.
Cool. Natasha's going to talk about the first question in some detail, how we do it in the Thriving Earth Exchange, and you're kind of on the right track. It's an iterative and collaborative process, and it's less about identifying an issue and solving it, and more about building processes that allow issues to be addressed and issues interconnect. And then I'll talk a little bit about some of the institutional structures that we've been thinking about to try to support this work. Um, Continuing the interactive part, I think we'll go to the first poll question. So, given this definition of community science, um, I'm going to ask you if you think this is an example of community science. And I'll be honest, this is a little bit of a trick because if you, after you answer, I'm going to ask you to talk about why you answered what you answered. So, collecting data to verify a traditional way of knowing, is it an example of community science in the way we've been kind of defining it here? If you think it is, click yes. If you think it isn't, click no. All right, I'm going to give you 5 more seconds to click. And let's see the results if we could, please. Ah, 50-50, perfect. Awesome. So somebody who clicked yes, why is it an example of community science? Unmute, please, and just tell us.
Well, it could, I mean, if the community and this, if everyone has agreed to collect certain data for a particular reason in a traditional scientific way, but for, I mean, so I think it could be a tool. I don't think it would be the only thing, and it'd have to be very collaborative.
Cool. So it kind of depends how you did it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of our principles was how you work is inseparable from the work you do. So totally resonates. Who else on the yes side? Anybody want to add any yes? Alexis is on you, like gives you a thumbs up. She agrees. Alexis, do you want to come off mute and say why this resonates with you? Sorry to do that. Like you probably chatted because you
Oh,
didn't want to.
no,
Thanks.
you're fine. I think just reflecting on the piece around the community priorities, that was really what was my thought was if it is a community priority, then I would say yes. If it's not, then um it might be in the future, but the priorities should really be defined by the community at the time that you're trying to do it.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. coming back to that notion of priorities and maybe relating that a little bit to what Dan was asking about, pragmatically, one of the strategies of community science is earning trust by doing something together first, right? So the priorities can expand over time, and maybe down the road, science can, or there can be a priority that's contributed, and the community can say, yeah, that does sound like something we'd like to do, but that's probably not the way to start. So in the case like this, where it came out of a community conversation and it's collaborative, feels like it hits the community science button. I also saw about 50% of you said no. So what made you say no?
Hi, this is Jorge.
Thanks, Jorge.
I was thinking that when I saw the proposed statement, I was thinking about priorities for
Uh-huh.
the community, and I was thinking about outcome
Uh-huh.
based on your definition of community science. And that wasn't clear to me. It wasn't clear that collecting data was a priority for the community. And it wasn't clear to me what would the impact be.
Fair, great point, right? That didn't include a community impact. It hinted towards one maybe, but it didn't include it. Thanks, Jorge. Who else would add to the no category? I'll ask a leading question. Was anybody troubled by the word validate?
I was troubled actually more by the word traditional. I think that's what made me
Okay.
hesitate.
Go ahead,
Because I
Emily.
think traditionally in my definition, we have excluded so many communities.
Ah, nice.
So that's why I went with a no.
Yeah, okay. So if tradition means that tradition of being kind of exclusive, then definitely not.
Mhm.
Thanks, Emily. Sam, you showed your camera for a second, so I'm thinking you want to add.
Yeah, I was troubled by the word validate because it seemed like there it implied that the traditional knowledge or approach needed to be validated by external scientists.
Yeah, other
So
groups have.
it didn't center, again, like others have said, what the community priorities are. And it did sound like it was imposing some external critique of what the community might have been doing thus far or their current understanding.
Yeah, it implied a kind of hierarchy of science, didn't it? There's a researcher at Northwestern who talks about the assumed epistemological superiority of science, and that validate can land on folks like that. I absolutely agree. Pamela.
I wanted to add that you shouldn't start off a study or like any kind of research with like your idea of traditional in mind. It's different if it's like a hypothesis. However, the fact that it says validate and traditional in the same sentence mainly lean towards no.
Yeah, I think those are all good points. Thank you, Pamela. That's absolutely right, and I think it builds on kind of what we've been talking about here. And I think in some ways the message of this quiz is that there really is no definition, like there is no hard boundary between community science and other ways of doing science, but there are some elements of community science that are around humility, around asking the questions together, around setting priorities together, around valuing all kinds of knowledge. And those can be expressed through the work. And often, one of the things I might ask a group to do is rewrite that sentence so that it does feel more consistent with the values of community science, recognizing that it starts there and it can always go farther. And I think what I like about an exercise like that is it sort of recognizes that community science is a process, and you may start in one place. And as you do this work, you'll become even more deeply engaged in these community processes and even more co-creative. It's sort of like there's always room to grow when you do community science. And I like to sort of use that as an invitation to dip your toe in wherever you're comfortable and to grow into it as you go, right? So that that there's always a welcoming space for people to participate in this work, and there's always room to get better and better at this work as we go. I don't think I'm going to do the rest of the quiz questions because you guys got it. Like, you all nailed it, both the yes and the no. And so I'm going to hand it over to Natasha to talk a little bit more about Thriving Earth Exchange. And then I think I come back and talk about some of the institutional practices that can support this work.
Great. Thank you, Raj. So good afternoon, good day, everyone. My name is Natasha Udu-gama. I am the director of Thriving Earth Exchange. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm joining you from the traditional lands of the Anacostan, Piscataway, and Nacotchtank peoples in the Hyattsville, Maryland area, just outside of Washington, D.C. And if you're having any trouble seeing, I am a brown woman with medium length brown hair, wearing a purple shirt against a green and yellow background with AG Thriving Earth Exchange emblazoned. So just to build on Dan's question to Raj earlier, I'll tell you a little bit more about how community science is integrated and has formed the foundation of Thriving Earth Exchange at AGU. So for nearly a century, AGU's Earth and space scientists excelled in our research and publications, pushing the boundary of knowledge from the core of the Earth to the surface of the sun and everything in between. So we have 350,000 Earth and space science members and affiliates who study everything from the surface of the Earth, from the core of the Earth to the surface of the sun and everything in between. Our traditional approach has followed that top-down model at AGU, and we often referred to it as that loading dock model of science, where scientists conducted research, published their findings, and hoped that they would be integrated somehow into the decision-making processes of communities. So back in 2012, AGU established Thriving Earth Exchange to better address how AGU could better bring our Earth and space sciences to benefit humanity in a more tangible way. And so we decided to start up the Thriving Earth Exchange as an opportunity to bridge that gap. It essentially became a grand challenge for our centennial in 2019, where we were connecting communities and scientists to advance those local priorities and sharing our community science framework with global partners. So we have now since evolved into a program that basically brings into account those core principles that Raj mentioned earlier. And we've now conducted nearly 300 projects in communities around the country and around the world to bring pro bono scientists together with community leaders to advance those local priorities. So our mission at Thriving Earth Exchange is to strengthen and enhance collaboration among communities of all types, communities of place, interest, advocacy, faith-based organizations, indigenous communities, and scientists and partner organizations, so that all of these types of communities can build those healthy, resilient, thriving, just, and ecologically responsible futures that we want to get towards. So we're really hoping that we'll become a leader in contributing to global well-being by supporting communities' awareness and application of science and promoting equity by ensuring that all communities benefit from the opportunity to participate in, contribute to, and guide the use of scientific knowledge. So how does Thriving Earth Exchange work? We have evolved over a nearly 10-year period, 10 years now, where we basically bring in three key participants within a community science project. As we said, it always starts with community priorities first. So therefore, community leaders, their representation of the community knowledge, context, and guidance throughout the project is critical to the understanding of what those communities need, what they prioritize. And typically we have 1 to 2 community leaders who lead up each of these projects. Secondly, we have, as I mentioned earlier, over 350,000 Earth and space science members and affiliates from which we bring those volunteer community scientists. So scientists and technical experts who are willing and able to volunteer their expertise to address the technical aspects of the project and dedicate upwards of 3 to 4 hours a week for up to 18 months. And they typically can be 1 to 5 community scientists on a project. And last but certainly not least are our community science fellows. We started the Community Science Fellows program back in 2019 as an opportunity for early career, mid-career, late career, retired and even science interested public to learn our community science approach and basically become connected one-on-one with these projects to guide them through our community science project from idea to implementation. So these are project managers who guide these teams through our process from start to finish. So essentially, this is how it all works. All of these different pieces of the team connect with Thriving Earth Exchange staff and our project participants. As I mentioned earlier, the community leads, they bring that community context and knowledge, the insights and connection. They are there to represent and speak on behalf of the community, and they engage widely in that community. The community science fellows basically take those projects from idea to implementation, and they're the ones that help to recruit the community scientists. And the community scientists, they're not just people who have the scientific knowledge and expertise. Oftentimes, even our community leads have that too. But they come with this idea of really active listening, engaging as a representative of the scientific community in ways that are equitable and ensuring that the science is relevant, responsive, and meaningful for those community priorities. So, as I mentioned, this model that we've developed over the last 10 years is a flexible approach that provides a guiding framework, which then enable us to do community science. So it's a framework. We always start with scoping, basically understanding what is it that the community wants to do. They might come to us with 1 to 3 different ideas, and our community science fellows basically help to hone that in. And once they have honed that in and developed out a project description, they move on to the match section. And matching is really all about really understanding what is it that the communities need, what is it that what kinds of scientists and technical experts will best suit working with that community. And the community science fellow basically reaches out within our network to really understand who would be best suited. So we can basically do a search within 15 minutes to understand like what is the best type of technical expert, but we only know who will be sort of suitable to work within those communities by really getting a sense of who those people are, what their motivations are, and how they work. And then, of course, the majority of the project happens in Solve. That's when the project team comes together, they develop a community agreement, a project plan, and the community science fellow basically leads that team towards an impactful tool or solution that the community group has come to develop together. And through it all, we ask all of our projects to really share the highlights, the impacts that they're having in these different communities. So our model really gives that one-to-one community scientist pair, a dedicated project manager. It's free to all communities. It's an all volunteer effort. And the reason for that is that we want everyone to come to the table as much as possible in an equitable manner. And so therefore we've ensured that everyone is coming to the table without necessarily being paid to do that work, so that both community leads, scientists, and community fellows all have an equitable say at the table. And projects also have access to easily accessible microgrants as well. So the typical types of projects, as I mentioned, it's all around earth and space sciences. It's environmental health, it's natural hazards, natural resources, environmental pollution, sustainability, environment, natural hazards and social resilience, as well as climate change. And you know, this basically outlines the types of projects that we do. We can now support projects who are interested in working in Spanish. And some examples of outputs tend to be like reports, webinars, interviews, communications materials, maps, podcasts, and outcomes tend to be policy changes, enhanced communication, changing habits, and other data-driven information. So you might be asking, so how do we get involved? And we really want you to be asking that question because we're hoping that you will be motivated and encouraged to get involved in community science. And Thriving Earth Exchange is one of those ways that you can do that. So there are a couple of ways. You can get involved as a community scientist, and we currently have upwards of about 30 different projects available on our website that are seeking scientists of all types. You can either sign up through our website. We have a database. or you can apply directly to the project. All career stages are welcome, and we select on a rolling basis. So even if you put your name in our database, you might not necessarily be called until and unless there's a project that requires your skills and expertise. And then, of course, there's also becoming a community science fellow, which is also open to those with a undergraduate degree and above, and equitable experience if you don't have an undergraduate degree, up to about 3 years. So we'll train you up in our Thriving Earth Exchange community science approach. And we're offering 3 trainings in 2024. And so I encourage you to check out our website, get an opportunity to do that. And some of the reasons to become a community science, I'll just touch on here. There's a lot here, but it's an opportunity to really provide your technical expertise and develop research protocol, analyze existing data to support those community priorities that you might not have had at your respective universities and other institutions. So there's a lot of community benefits. It applies your scientific expertise to address those real world problems and provides technical expertise, especially to vulnerable and or marginalized communities. And some of the professional benefits, obviously, there are many, I think, but there's increased engagement and networking with AGU and other similar societies. You might have opportunities to come to Washington, D.C. to speak to congressional representatives, share your work in community science exchange and other AGU newsletters, and we can provide all those details later. And then, of course, our fellows, there's an opportunity now to, if you're interested, right after this call, you can apply by the 7th of December. There are projects that will be located all over the country and increasingly all over the world. And you'll basically have an opportunity to get more experience as a project manager, find those scientist matches, liaise between those communities and scientists, and really get all this opportunity working remotely, essentially. So I will leave it there and encourage you all to check us out at thrivingearthexchange.org. And I will turn it back over to Raj so that he can tell you a little bit more about how all of this is helping AGU advance community science.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Natasha. Before I do that, there's a cool conversation that happened in the chat. Penny talked about a project in Jupiter, Florida that Max Planck is bringing out, doing neuroscience field trips, taking neuroscience directly into schools in the county, reached 33,000 students at underserved schools in the K-12. And the question someone asked is, how could this, let me ask it this way, without knowing much about this and taking, it sounds like a cool thing. What would you, if you were designing something like this, if you were thinking about how do I take an outreach, like a sort of a neuroscience outreach program, what would you do to make it more community science-ish? What are some of the ways in which you could do this in a way that's consistent with these kinds of principles that we talked about? And then, yeah. Think about it for a couple of minutes, and then I would love ideas for how to do this in a community science way. When you have an idea or you're ready to share, either raise your hand or come off mute. Great, Jorge. In the chat, Jorge suggested maybe you think about the specific concerns brought up by the community, such as Alzheimer's disease, neurodivergent children, etc. So you might do that through a survey ahead of time before you even design the curriculum. Maybe an even more community science approach might be to begin your conversation with the students around what kinds of things they're already observing that are related to neuroscience in their community and what they have questions about. That's great. What else? Thanks, Jorge. linking it to something people are already thinking about. Penny, do you want to come off mute, talk about that a little bit, or happy to have you weigh in if you'd like? I will say, I will offer this, that I think it's wonderful for scientists to be involved in supporting students in their interest in STEM and science. I think for community science, we often add a lens of what else beyond STEM and science is important to the community, and how can that engagement in STEM and science support those kind of community priorities as well. So some communities are, I think about it as what can science do to be an ally, so that people are engaging in STEM and learning STEM, but also accomplishing something through that engagement in STEM, so that they might be engaged even if they aren't per se interested in STEM and stuff. I don't know if that's helpful. All right, I'm going to kind of continue, if that's all right with everybody, and talk about some of the ways in which we try to institutionally support and advance this work. And the key idea here is allyship, that thanks, Penny. Sorry that your audio is not working. So really appreciate this. And Alexis, thank you for that. You emphasized, so Alexis wrote that this aligns with critical service learning pillars, social change orientation, absolutely. Working to redistribute power and developing authentic relationships. Those are all implied in this model. So thanks for articulating that. I would say in our experience, the redistributing power is sometimes the most controversial. And when we think about institutional roles to support this work, that's where we really sometimes stumble, right? Because what we really are asking here is to share some of the privilege of setting priorities with people who maybe haven't traditionally been in those institutions and in those places. And so we're asking institutions to share some of their power. One of the ways we do that is through this fellows program. Each of the fellows has a hands-on experience doing a community science project, and they take that forward into their career, and they become advocates sometimes, and sometimes evangelists for doing that work. At the least, they become sort of knowledgeable about the work, and they share that work with their colleagues. So big part of our change initiative is helping people engage in the work in a meaningful way, and then giving them the tools to carry that work forward. We do that mostly through our fellows program. A second way we try to support this work is by elevating it. We try to elevate not Thriving Earth Exchange, but the communities and the priorities, and the communities and the scientists who are involved in the work of community science. It usually engages local media a lot, because these are very impactful. It engages national media somewhat less. When we articulate the value of this work, we tend to lead with the community values. And the way we sell that internally to a science-based organization is when a community talks about the value of working with a science organization, it gives the science more credibility than when the scientists themselves talk about the value of science. We see that again and again. And it's also, frankly, a little bit more engaging for people outside the science community to sort of learn about community outcomes rather than learn about sort of straight ahead science engagement the way we have historically often done it. The next thing is this idea of learning, right? In addition to this very intensive hands-on experience, we want to create some opportunities for people to learn about this through seminars, through webinars. We've been working on a curriculum that would introduce justice-centered community science. And one of the things we've noticed is that many of the institutions that are most engaged in community work are the institutions, minority serving institutions, community colleges. And so we want to create a platform for them to share and elevate their experience in this work. And so when we design these curricula, we try to design it with those communities, with those institutions that have been doing this work historically for a long time and perhaps been under-supported in that work. And then the next way we try to advance this work is there we go. We recognize that institutional supports often incentivize and reward certain kinds of activities. A paper counts if you're a scientist. So even though a paper isn't the outcome we strive for, it's often the outcome a practicing scientists might need to integrate this into their professional career in a way that's beneficial. So we want to create a venue where those kinds of papers can be published. We've partnered with 4 other societies to launch a new journal that celebrates that creates an academic home for this kind of work in the physical sciences and in the medical sciences and in the anthropology. At the same time, we recognize that just publishing papers reinforces this notion that papers are the only valid outcome. So we've created an unjournal where we can start to publish and share some of the non-paper outcomes of these projects. And our hope is that by publishing these two side by side, we can start to morph. We can start to push on the boundaries of what counts as a scientific product, what gets rewarded by tenure, what gets rewarded by promotion. And we want to reinforce that through the awards that we offer in our society. So one of our volunteer communities actually launched a new award called the Science and Society Team Award. It's the first award given to teams because community science is about teams, not individuals. And it's an award explicitly to elevate the work of community science. And I think the last thing we do is try to really change policy. One of the things we did recently was on the invitation of NSF, we actually brought together a series of community-based organizers, scientists, a broad community to think about what it would mean to authentically support this work. And we produced a policy brief for the National Science Foundation, for other funding agencies, for research institutions, for academic institutions, and even for individual scientists that outlined a set of principles, practices, and concrete actions that people can engage in order to advance community science. So community science began with AGU with the experience of doing it through these intense projects, partnering with local communities, and now we're starting to build sort of layers and tiers around that to enable more and more people to engage in that work, with the idea that over time we can change, we can evolve the culture of science so that community science is as much a part of the methodology of the sciences as things like numerical modeling or bench chemistry. It's just another way of doing the work of science, a way that's engaging, a way that speaks to people in a way that engages people. And I think with that, that's the end of the formal presentation. I see stuff going on in the chat, so let's take down the slides and have a little bit of a conversation about all of this.
Thank you. What questions do folks have? We'd love to entertain those questions and have a conversation.
Yeah, Julian, I'm going to answer your question about the topic of funding. One of the recommendations that came out of that report that we did was that there needs to be funding mechanisms that are accessible to community-based organizations, and that the current funding structures create really difficult barriers for small organizations to access funding. And that instead of, in addition to funding scientific projects where scientists receive money and then work with community groups, we want to create mechanisms, or we recommended mechanisms where community-based organizations receive funding and then select the scientists they want to work with and compensate those scientists accordingly. So really kind of flipping that model and offering both as appropriate.
Yeah, that's a great question. Just adding on to that, we have seen, more funders coming to understand that, this, like in our most recent grant, as Raj mentioned, we have gotten a little bit extra funding to support community leaders, but we still have yet more to do, I think, when it comes to being able to involve, say, fellows or scientists from, say, underprivileged backgrounds who want to get involved in this work, which I think will enable us to work with more underserved and marginalized communities in the long term. I see some other questions here in the chat too. Alexis, you're asking about whether undergraduates have served as fellows. We haven't, mainly because I think we require a certain amount of expertise to be able to work with communities. And we've realized that having a little bit of experience, either scientific or non-scientific even, does help those fellows, work with those oftentimes very complicated community issues and complex relationships a little bit better. Also, we want to be able to set up the fellows so that they're respected also by the community leads, to take them through this process in a way that will ensure that there is impact for the community leads. So even if they don't necessarily have an undergraduate degree, I think having like at least 3 years of experience working, collaboratively in an environment with communities is super beneficial. Dennis, would you like to come off mute maybe and tell us a little bit more about, there's a lot to read, and so I don't want to like have too much dead air. So if you can come off mute, that would be awesome. And Penny as well. Oh, but I think Penny's okay. No problem. No problem, Dennis. So you were asking about, you like the title of a scientist being an active listener. You've seen a lot of community engagement for scientists about being a talker. That's right. And just sharing their knowledge. So that title of listening really does underscore a different role. Yes, I mean, this is really what AGU and Thriving Earth Exchange are trying to turn on its head a little bit, because we've typically been seeing, and we still have this with some communities who come to us saying that they expect that the scientists would do X, Y, Z for them, not realizing that the whole idea and the whole intention behind the community science and Thriving Earth Exchange is to bring community leads and scientists together on an equitable level and provide those community leaders an opportunity to provide the community context and knowledge that they have about those communities and those issues, to be able to advance those community priorities, so that it's not just having, pro bono consultants, as it might be. I always think about a project we did in the city of Atlanta many years ago, where I had to have this talk with the community leaders because they assumed that the community scientists were there sort of as, glorified consultants. So, yeah. Thank you, Dan. Thank you. Any other questions or comments?
Oh, I have a quick question. You might have said this,
Sure.
and I'm sorry, but like, how does a project become a AGU project? Did you talk about that?
I did not, actually. That's a great question, Caitlin. So like as you all know, AGU is a scientific society. We didn't have those community connections. And so it was back in 2015 where we kind of had this breakthrough where we were able to make a few what we call partnerships with community serving organizations. So organizations that boast networks of communities like the National League of Cities, the ICLEI, USA, Local Governments for Sustainability. And what those organizations helped us to do was to sort of get the word out in their networks, build some reputation and trust amongst the communities in their networks, and bring us potential communities that would be willing and able to work with our scientists. So basically having the capacity, having the bandwidth, the time, the resources in some ways to work with our community scientists to develop these projects. And, I think with all of those partnerships, with all the work we've done now in the last 10 years, we have gotten to a place where communities are now coming to us mostly through word of mouth. Around certain issues like flooding or hydraulic fracturing and things like that. So they apply basically on our website in pretty much a rolling basis, but we have cohorts, so there are deadlines. And then our community lead program manager will basically talk to them, make sure that they're a good fit, and then move them forward to work with our community scientists and fellows. Thanks for that question, Caitlin.
Oh, I'm Lisa, but that's fine. I might follow up with you too. Raj, I didn't realize you were in Boulder. I'm in Boulder too, at CU Boulder.
Oh yeah, I
And
see
there,
the background.
yeah, it's Anita's, yeah. There's just a group in geosciences that has approached us to do workshops with them on community science, and it just seems like we should talk.
Yeah, all right, that would be great.
That would be great. Yeah. So
Um,
Timothy, you asked a question about what is AGU? A great question. Sorry, Raj, I think I cut you off. Did you want to say something?
Go for it.
Okay, so AGU, we prefer to go by the letters right now, but traditionally it's been the American Geophysical Union. And the reason we prefer to go by the letters is because we're not purely American. Our 350,000 plus members and affiliates are in 147 countries. We're not just geophysical, which is the second letter. Our scientists and technical experts study everything from the core of the earth to the surface of the sun and everything in between. And we're not a labor union, so that's what the U stands for. So yeah, it's still a point of contention, I think, even within our board about changing the name or not. But because we've been AGU for over 100 years, I think it's right now going to stick. You're welcome, Timothy. Oh, and Dennis, I'm sorry, I skipped over your question. Are other scientific institutions starting to follow this model? It's a great question. Yes, I would say so. The American Sociological Association actually started something called the Sociological Action Network a few years after Thriving Earth Exchange started. So that's getting more sociologists out into the, like, I mean, they obviously do a lot of field work, but doing this kind of work in more community science ways. I think that we could do better still as scientific societies to connect all of this work, because we understand at AGU and Thriving Earth Exchange that our communities don't just need Earth and space scientists, they actually need all of the scientists to work together, and they often need more than just Earth and space scientists. Yeah, how many cities and communities have we worked with? You're welcome, Dennis. One of the most prominent. Yes, and I'm sorry, I realize this is an oversight. I meant to share a few examples in this presentation, but we do have all of the projects we've ever done on our All Projects page under Thriving Earth Exchange. So we've worked with almost 300 now at this point, cities and communities in about 11 countries, including the United States. And some of the most prominent have been, there's a project we did in Tajikistan and Afghanistan, one of our first projects, looking at the adapting the traditional Pamiri calendars of the human body to a changing climate, because it had been not used for over 100 years because of all of the unrest in that area. And we were able to, there were 17 Pamiri villages who came to a human ecologist out of Cornell, and essentially he brought that issue to us, and we helped him develop a consortium of climate scientists and others to help recalibrate that calendar of the human body, so that those communities could, start to harvest and plant mulberries and peaches and other sorts of crops in that area. And yeah, sure, I know we're at the top of the hour. So that particular project has been able to get 1.5 million euros and gone on to do some really amazing things. I encourage you to take a look at all of the projects on our website, please. And thank you. All right, I think we're at the top of the hour. So thank you so much, everyone. Appreciate you sticking around, and please do keep in touch.